X, well, I've cheated a bit for this one. I've said X is for... Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to Phil's Corner. It's starting to get a bit darker here in the UK. The nights are getting longer, but the football shirts continue. They don't stop. And today's episode is going to be a bit of a rundown of all the things you need to know, the terms, the brands, the names that you need to know. This is the A to Z of football shirts, something which I've been thinking of doing for a while. I've sat down and painstakingly chosen something for each letter of the alphabet, and we're going to go through that today. I'll keep the intro a bit shorter today so we can get straight into the episode. I will remind you though to subscribe if you are watching this and you're not subscribed to the channel. Hit the subscribe button and the bell icon too, and you'll get notified when I go live on my live streams, which we do most weeks, and when videos like this go on the channel as well, you'll get notifications. So do that and support the channel in that way. And if you want to go even further, I have a Patreon which has a bunch of really cool benefits. The best one being a shirt which I've designed with the wonderful brand Icarus. All the details are in the link below. And final note to say that if you have any questions for me, leave them in the comments. I like to answer your questions in these sorts of videos. So if you've got any questions about shirts, about collecting, anything you'd like to ask me, stick it in the comments of today's video. And at the start of the next episode, I'll answer a bunch of them. But I don't think this one needs much more introduction. We are going to be doing, as I say, something for each letter of the alphabet. And for some of these, I've kind of maybe stretched the rules slightly, but I've tried as best as possible to stick to the letters. And there's a variety of stuff here. We're talking about brands, we're talking about some people even in the industry, we're talking about elements of a kit, elements which make a good or bad football shirt. But there's something for everyone here. Let's start with A, and A is for Adidas. Now, Adidas, of course, are one of the biggest brands in the world, let alone in football. But they've been so important to football shirts, and we don't have time to really dive into this deeply. But I will briefly touch on what I would consider to be one of, if not the golden era for football shirts, and that was the late 80s, the 1980s, where Adidas were kings. And of course you all know the Germany 88 design, the Holland 88 design. When you ask people what are the greatest football shirts of all time, they go to Adidas 80 shirts. But of course Adidas are still big players, and I think to look at a more modern example of their best work, look at the Women's World Cup, the most recent set of kits for that. The away shirts from that tournament for Adidas were absolutely brilliant, some of the best of 2023. So a hugely important brand, and I'm pretty sure 99% of you, if you have a collection, will have at least one Adidas shirt in that collection. B is for Blackout. The Blackout trend in football shirts has been one of the strongest, most pervasive trends in the industry in the past 5 to 10 years. And it's become something of a cliche in many ways. We could talk a lot about trends, and I think this will be potentially quite an interesting video in future to talk about some of the trends we've seen, the design trends that we've seen. But the Blackout trend, I think, is perhaps one of the biggest trends for a number of reasons. Like any good trend, it has gone from the top levels of the game, so top international and club kits, all the way down to grassroots kits. Everyone seems to be doing Blackout kits, and they are popular each and every time. Of course, people in the community, people like myself, we kind of get a bit bored of them because we see so many Blackout kits. But for the typical fan, the average consumer, they absolutely love Blackout kits. And I think what's really interesting about the Blackout trend is that we see even things like leisure wear versions of shirts. England did a really popular retro remake, which was essentially just one of their old kits in a Blackout style, completely ahistorical, nothing like what they actually wore, but it was really popular. And there's something to be said about the wearability of Blackout shirts. I think that's one of the reasons the trend has been so popular. But there's been some really good examples of it. I really like one particular SK brand shirt which combined a Blackout design with iridescent application. So not strictly Blackout, it did have the iridescent elements. But yeah, a big trend, and certainly something which I think we will look back on in years and decades to come and so it really did help to define the late 10s and early 20s in football shirts. C is for collars. When you think about any football shirt, the collar is one of the most important aspects of a football shirt. Do you go for a big flappy collar? Do you go for a simple crew neck? Of course, when you think about collars, you also have to talk about necklines, so things like V-necks and grandad collars, and there's so many directions you can go. And it's very rare that a club or international team will not have any collars in their history. The majority of teams will experiment with a collar because it is one of those elements of a shirt which can add a nice point of differentiation year on year, especially when you've got things like a home shirt. But yeah, collars are a really important part of football shirts, and you can probably extend this to cuffs as well. One of the best things is when a football shirt has matching collar and cuff details or patterns or colours. That's always a really nice thing to look out for, and a simple point which can really elevate a design. D is for Drake Ramberg, one of the most important designers in football shirts, and certainly one of my favourite designers of football shirts. Many of you will know the name, but if you don't know Drake Ramberg by name, you'll certainly know his work, most notably with the likes of Borussia Dortmund. Ramberg worked with Nike during the 90s, and this was a really important period for the brand. We talked about Adidas before and how they were kings of the football shirt world in the 80s. Nike at that time were relative newcomers, but in the 90s they really accelerated their market share and their presence in the industry. And what was really cool about the work that Drake Ramberg and his colleagues did was that they really took full advantage of new technology and particularly computer-aided design, which was becoming the norm in the 90s, but they really maximised that to create crazy patterns, bold patterns, but not just crazy patterns for the sake of being crazy. There was really thoughtful design that went into these shirts. If you look at those Dortmund shirts, one of the reasons people like me fawn over them so much was because there was a really great use of bold colours, and I particularly liked how Dortmund would often restrict the patterns to the sleeves of the kit, which added a nice balance to the whole thing. So Drake Ramberg, know the name, and by extension we could talk about designers in general. There are many big designers in the football shirt world. Often their names aren't talked about, often they're not in the limelight, but do go out there and look up some of these people who are both working now in the industry and who used to work in the industry. These are the people whose designs we adore, we collect and we love. The least we could do is give them a shout out. So I've picked out Drake particularly because his work is a personal favourite of mine, but there are many others as well. Shout out to Drake Ramberg though, he is certainly someone you should know about. E is for embossing or embossed, and I absolutely love embossed details. I think for me it's one of the best things that a football shirt brand can do, using embossed patterns and embossed details to elevate a design. I was recently writing a piece for Football Shirt Collective, who I do a lot of work for, and I was looking at Mizuno, and Mizuno are a brand who are really coming back into the football shirt world, and I was highlighting some of the work that Mizuno are doing in relation to embossed details. Just look at some of these shirts on the screen now. This isn't a new technique, we've seen this sort of thing in shirts for a little while, but I really hope that we see brands continue to go down this direction, because for me it's this kind of slightly more subtle approach which I think stands the test of time. Don't get me wrong, I love bold print, crazy sublimated patterns, but I think embossed patterns are the kind of thing where you get a shirt in your hands and you can feel the difference and you can see it in the light, and the way that an embossed pattern might look to me is often leagues above, again, a simple print. And we'll talk about this again on another letter on this list, about ways you can create really, really strong patterns. But I love embossed details, and I'd love to see more brands really lean into it. Again, I think it's something which Mizuno are doing well, but there are other brands, many brands, the likes of Macron have been quite good for this as well in recent years. Really good, and I love to see this. Anytime a shirt has embossed details, it automatically goes up a few points in my personal rankings. Good thing to look out for, and a great technique which many brands have used over the years to strong effect. F is for flag details, and I love when particularly international kits, but club kits too, incorporate flags as part of the kit. So to give a current example, Napoli's home shirt is a wonderful design which utilises the Italian flag. And talking more broadly about Italian football, I love the tradition that Italian clubs have when the winners of the league get a flag based patch, and indeed the winners of the Coppa Italia also get a roundel with the flag as a detail, as a patch. And it's a simple thing, but I think often when I look back on kits, and again often international kits, it's the ones which really cleverly incorporate flags which stand out to me. And to give another example, you know when Adidas kits use flag colours on the 3 stripes, it looks great. It's such a easy win, I think, in many ways. And obviously if brands and clubs and teams did this every time, every season, we'd maybe get bored of it. But more often than not, I think it's a great thing, and I really like seeing that. I think there's something to be said about flags and shirts, and flags in many ways, the makeup of a flag, the look of a flag, you immediately are drawn in and you have that connection with a place in the same way that you do with shirts. Football shirts are kind of like flags really in many ways. So I think it's no coincidence that when you see flags incorporated into kits, it often really works. It often makes a lot of sense, makes for a great kit. So flag details, a really cool thing to see in football shirts. G is for goalkeeper kits, and this is a huge one. We could talk a long time about goalkeeper kits. Often goalkeeper kits are the weird and wonderful designs of football, and indeed particularly in the 80s and 90s, where we saw the likes of Campos designing his own kits and other keepers designing their own kits. We got some crazy designs. And though in the modern game it's often the outfield kits which are the craziest ones, goalkeeper kits still have that special place in our hearts. But I think particularly when you go back again to the older eras, it's so fun to see the complete abandon, the complete freedom that goalkeeper kits often have. I'd love to talk more about how you used to get the padded sleeves on keeper kits. That was a really fun time. I'm sure many of you will remember. Maybe you have some keeper kits in your collections with the kind of really funny details which you obviously wouldn't get on outfield shirts. So an important slice, a big slice of the football shirt world, that is the letter G. H is for hoops. Now in many ways I'd love to have included a number of different pattern styles, things like stripes, sashes, quarters, half and half. We've not really been able to do that because of the limitations, and I wanted to cover different topics. But I did want to highlight hoops because I think that's one of my favourite styles. And of course hoop shirts have been going for a long time. Hoops are one of the most consistent styles. Again, styles do come and go in shirts, and if you look at football shirt history, stuff comes in and out of fashion, but hoops are easily one of the most consistent. A lot has changed in the football shirt world, things like the introduction of sponsors and shirt numbers, but these kind of pattern styles like stripes and hoops have always been there, and they've always been an important way of identifying the team through shirts. So in 100, 200 years time, if we're still playing football by then, there will still be hoop shirts, as there will be stripes and other classic key pattern styles. I is for iridescent, another trend which has really picked up in recent years. Now we've talked a lot about trends on B is for blackout, so I don't want to cover the same ground, but what I do want to highlight is the fact that applications on shirts are so important, and iridescent applications have become really popular. We've seen that on a number of prominent shirts in recent years. I think the style is quite nice. I think it's often worked quite well on designs. But again, broadly speaking, when you look at a shirt, you want to see what are those applications made of. Is it an embroidered application? Is it a TPU or plastic application? Some brands opt for fully sublimated applications, which actually can be really good from a wearability or a durability perspective. So there's a lot to be said about those elements of the shirts, which are again added onto the kit. But the iridescent style that we've seen, I think, has been really fun. It's been really interesting to see brands innovate in this area. And ultimately, trends exist for a reason. They exist because they are, broadly speaking, quite popular. And I think the iridescent trend has actually been a really welcome one. It's not been exhausted quite as much as the blackout trend, I would say, or the black and gold trend. We didn't even talk about that. That's another one we could have done for B. But yeah, I is for iridescent. I really do think, again, this is one which I've personally quite enjoyed. it'll be fun to see in the future how maybe we'll see even more of a push in this kind of stylistic direction, in this kind of aesthetic direction. No doubt we'll see colour changing shirts and shirts which look pretty futuristic in many ways, and I think this kind of style is an obvious direction, but I think it is one which makes a lot of sense and it does have a lot of creative potential. Just seeing how people have latched onto it in recent years just highlights how there is an appetite for this kind of more crazy, colourful, changeable direction. J is for Jacquard, and this is a really important technique, a really important production technique to be aware of. Many of the great shirts of yesteryear, of the 80s and 90s, these kind of golden periods that we talk about, did have Jacquard patterns. And a Jacquard is quite simply a more complex pattern in the material, in the fabric of a shirt, which is achieved through a Jacquard machine or loom, depending on if it's knitted or woven. Most football shirts are knitted though. And it's these kind of often quite subtle subliminal patterns which really add a lot of depth to a shirt. And again, it's something which I hope brands might return to. Now, there are different reasons why we kind of moved away from Jacquard patterns, and indeed there were cost implications involved in that certainly, and the kind of technological direction that we went down where we were trying to reduce weight. But Jacquard patterns are so good to look at, and again, like we talked about with the embossed discussion, when you see a shirt with the Jacquard and you get to see often things like crest details or other elements in the body of a shirt, it looks so good. And so many of my favourite shirts of recent years have made use of Jacquard patterns. Think of something like the Vaporknit shirts from Nike, which we talked about again on my last video, on the Inter Milan video, that wonderful fingerprint pattern which was a Jacquard pattern. I really hope brands continue to push in this area, and again, it's kind of a retro thing, or it's certainly a thing which brands used to do a lot more with their shirts. We kind of went away from that, but it's coming back in. So J is for Jacquard, a really important technique. K is for Kettering Tyres. Now, way back in 1976, English club Kettering Town became the first club to have a shirt sponsor, and that would be the start of one of the biggest revolutions in football shirts. Shirt sponsors are controversial, they're beloved, they're a bit of everything in between, but no one can doubt their importance. And whether it's the financial side or the aesthetic implications, there are a few things which have changed the football shirt world more than sponsors. In today's game, there's a lot of focus to how sponsors are incorporated into a design, and broadly speaking, brands and clubs are quite good now at incorporating sponsors. But of course, there's also a discussion to be had about all the leagues around the world, how different leagues have different approaches to sponsors. Some leagues basically have no rules, and the more sponsors the better. You see shirts that look more like F1 cars than they do football kits. Other times you see things like competitions having very, very strict regulations on things like the size and style of sponsors, or even the type of sponsors. So it's always interesting to me when you see a club playing in Europe, say, and in some countries in Europe you're not allowed to have alcohol sponsors. And kit geeks like me get very excited when you see sponsors covered up by patches, or maybe you see a charity foundation logo instead of a sponsor. But yeah, it all goes back to Kettering Town and Kettering Tyres. So an important bit of football shirt history. L is for limited edition, and this is something which has become quite common now. Most clubs and teams will release some sort of limited edition shirt. I think for collectors it's an interesting area in particular, and it's something which I would say we're still only scratching the surface. Whilst limited edition kits are quite common, I do think there's scope for brands to push more in this area. Now, this would be controversial, I think, for many people, and there are many bad ways to do this. A lot of people rightly point out that fans of clubs often can't get hold of limited edition kits because other collectors and people who aren't even fans of a club might be trying to buy these kits and sometimes even sell them on. So there's a lot of potential pitfalls with this sort of thing, but I do think that if brands and clubs handle this well, it could be a really exciting element of shirts. And one thing I would love to see is for brands to extend the life cycle of home and away kits but still release limited edition kits and use that revenue stream and that avenue as a place to explore different ideas, to tell different stories of classic teams or even kind of new stories through the medium of limited edition kits, whilst in the same breath making home shirts a bit more valuable in terms of actually being worn for a couple of seasons. In my ideal world, you would actually have maybe even more shirts per season, but a lot of them being these kind of limited releases whilst keeping home and away shirts for a bit longer. That's a whole discussion. That's, you know, something which we talked about before on previous videos. But I do think limited edition kits are often really exciting. And as a collector, when you see some of these kind of box shirts, you know, we talked about the South Korea shirt there, which was limited to just 2,500. Again, when handled well, I think they can be a wonderful part of the football shirt world. It's a tricky thing to balance, and again, there's lots that could be said about the pros and cons, but that is L. M is for Mashup. Now, this was kind of a trend which kind of came and went. So a few years ago, it was very popular to see these kind of Mashup kits, and some of them were even worn on pitch. I think it's something like the Inter Milan Mashup kit, which was pretty crazy. It had elements of the different Nike Inter shirts, but many kind of pre-match shirts go down this direction. I think this is funny because that, as I say, as a trend, kind of came and went. Of course, it will still be there, and we still see Mashup kits in 2023. But I think it was kind of funny when I was looking back, compared to something like the Blackout trend, which has continued and has stayed quite prominently in the space. The Mashup trend never really had the same foothold. It's a little bit harder to kind of land well. Often these Mashup kits are done to celebrate things at anniversaries. And on a personal level, I wouldn't say Mashup kits tend to resonate that much with me, but there's certainly something to be aware of in football shirts. And again, I wanted to highlight that not all trends are created equal. Some, I think, do kind of have their time. I would say we've moved on a bit from that. But of course, in 5, 10 years, 20 years, we'll probably return to that because these things do come around. N is for Nike. And I had to talk about Nike. We talked about Adidas. And Nike and Adidas are the kind of two big players. Of course, over the years, we've had other brands which are at the top of the game. You think of brands like Admiral, who are significant, and the likes of Puma and Umbro have kind of had their day. But at the moment, it really is Nike and Adidas at the top of the football shirt world. And we spoke about Nike in the 90s. I really do think that is one of my favourite eras across football shirt history. So when we talked about Drake Ramberg earlier, I think that really is the place you can go to and see this is what Nike were doing, I would say, at their peak. But Nike have also been really important in the modern era. If we think of the post-Nigeria 2018 era that we've found ourselves in, this kind of revival of pattern-heavy shirts, pattern-led designs, Nike were at the forefront of that, and they really did, I think, a lot of good work. It wasn't just the Nigeria collection. That was undoubtedly one of the most popular collections of recent years, but I think in many ways Nike helped to kind of push us into this world that we're in. And even recent shirts like the recent Spurs, oil spill, Galaxy, away, whatever you want to call it. Designs like that certainly are ones we'll look back on and say, wow, that really was an example of a brand pushing the boat out. So Nike and Adidas, we could talk a lot about these two. And I think when you talk about one, you have to talk about the other. I'm looking forward to seeing how Nike kind of punch back, because in many ways, in the last couple of seasons, Nike's template which they've used, I don't think has been very good. We could talk more about that another time. But I'm expecting them to kind of turn it around. We'll see. It's always great to see how these two giants of the football shirt world interact year on year. O is for Onesie, and the Onesie kit that Cameroon had in the noughties. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about technology and innovation for this letter, and the Onesie kit, which many of you will remember, was a fascinating direction that Puma went down. And Puma had a bit of history, of course, because they also were pioneers with the sleeveless kit, which FIFA got involved with, and FIFA forced Cameroon and Puma to actually stitch on black sleeves for the 2002 World Cup. But the Onesie kit from a couple of years after that was a fascinating example of shirt technology innovation. And of course, there's a huge novelty factor to it. You kind of have to laugh and think, how do the players get into the shirt? How do they get into the kit? I believe there was a concealed zip. But it is really interesting looking back on some of these examples And just before these Cameroon kits, we had the Kappa Combat series, which again from a technology perspective was really important. Later in the decade and into the early 10s, Adidas were really pushing things forward with their tech fit and full motion ranges. So I think when it comes to shirt technology, it's really fun to see some of these developments, but we saw few bigger jumps or bigger kind of dart throws than the Cameroon onesie kit. All credit to Puma for pushing the boat out, and I kind of wish brands would do this more. Of course, there are more regulations now, and it's hard to do that if you're a bigger brand particularly. But I do think in order for the industry to move forward, we need to see more innovation like this. But I think it's fascinating to see these examples in football shirt history of when a brand or a team dared to do something a bit different. This is certainly one of, if not the most prominent example I can think of. So that is O. P is for player issue or player spec, and this is a really interesting and important aspect of football shirts. Indeed, for many years, players have worn particular shirts on the pitch which have been different to the ones that you can buy from your typical club store or retailer. But in recent years, that kind of definition has become quite defined, and now you do see terms like authentic being used for these player spec shirts, and replica being what we would typically think of as the shirts you buy in a store. I think we can also speak to the fact that the rise in interest around shirts and collectability of shirts has brought with it a heightened appetite for buying some of these player issue shirts. And that's brought some positives but also some negatives. So on the positive side, you're typically more able to buy player issue shirts than you were even 10-15 years ago. But of course, the rising cost of shirts could, I think, partly be attributed to the fact that more people are buying player spec shirts. And I would suggest that because more people are spending 3 figures on these player spec shirts, brands have felt more able to raise the price of replicas. There's other factors, of course, things like inflation and just brands being pretty greedy. So it's not just because of that. But I do think it's interesting to see how now many people collect these player spec shirts, and it's for good reason, because often these player spec shirts are the ones with these extra Jacquard details and extra kind of creative elements which you don't get on the replicas. And we talked about technology just now with the onesie kit. I think it's really interesting if you go further back in history and you had things like dual layered shirts and the kind of really rubbery shirts. We talked about full motion and tech fit, and Puma as well in the late 10s had these kind of really crazy rubberized designs which are just really hard to put on. If you get yourself a player issue shirt, a Puma shirt from again the kind of late 10s, you might struggle to literally put it on your body. There's so much rubber inside them. It's such a fascinating area, and for me, when I was getting into shirts, I was really interested in seeing how the shirts that players wore on the pitch differed from the ones you could get from a club store. And as a little bonus suggestion for P, I could have said P is for printing, because printing and name sets on shirts are really important, and again, this is a huge area, but P is for player issue or player spec. Now Q is a bit of a funny one. I've gone with quality fakes, and by that I mean that quite simply fake shirts have risen in quality significantly. I wanted to dedicate one letter to talk about fakes, and with F being flag details, I didn't want to do F is for fakes, but I've shoehorned it in for Q here. I think certainly it's fair to say that now fake shirts are closer to the real thing than they've ever been, and I've certainly been caught out over the years as a collector when I bought a shirt which I thought was real and it turned out to be fake. I think the biggest thing in this area is to educate yourselves on how to spot a fake football shirt, because despite the rise in quality, there are always telltale signs. You want to be looking at things like inside labels and product codes, the placement of swing tags, things like the details of an embroidered crest, really kind of comparing that to the real thing and seeing those differences. There are so many little elements which often are quite hard to spot online, but when you see in person you can kind of see, okay, that is definitely real, that is definitely not real. But having said that, again, the quality of face is so high that you do have to have your wits about you. And there's so much to be said about fakes. The fact that fakes are now more accepted, I would say, than ever before is no coincidence given the rising cost of football shirts, and brands need to do more. We talked about this recently on one of our videos about what brands can be doing to help combat fakes. But yeah, I wanted to talk about it because it is an important thing to be aware of. It's an important thing to understand. And I would always encourage you not to buy fake shirts. I think especially if you're a collector, fake shirts simply have no value. Despite the quality of them now, they don't have any resale value. They don't have any value in your collection, monetarily speaking. And regardless of value, there's also serious considerations around funding organised crime and things which often are linked to fake businesses, not just in football shirts, but more broadly speaking. Do read up about how to spot fakes. I've certainly written a bunch of stuff over the years. And if people would like content about fakes, stick it in the comments. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see stuff about how to spot fakes. We've done stuff in the past, but if you want to see maybe an updated video or just more of a kind of discussion on that, let me know. But Q is for quality fakes. R is for retro. Now, retro shirts are such a huge part of the industry. Undoubtedly, one of the most popular things or popular directions for a brand to go down is to remake an old kit, and more often than not we lap it up because we love the nostalgia of these old shirts. And there's nothing that makes you feel old like a retro kit which is from sort of 20 years ago and you realise, oh wow, now that's considered retro. I've certainly had that feeling when I see designs of the noughties being referenced and called retro. That's starting to make me feel a bit old. But retro kits often get a bad rep, and I would actually suggest that there are some really good examples, and there have been good examples over the years. So take something like, surprise surprise, a Boca Juniors shirt, which I really like, from the noughties. This particular design references Boca's first kit, which was a white shirt with dark pinstripes. I love how Nike interpreted that design and actually combined it with the aesthetic of a typical Boca home shirt. So you see the negative space that's created by the breaking of the pinstripes, having a central band like you would on a Boca home shirt. I really like this. I think it's a really creative way of taking an old design, bringing it forward and tweaking it and doing different things. This particular shirt, this Boca away shirt, was a key source of inspiration behind my Patreon shirt, the shirt that I did with Icarus. And you can see I kind of borrowed some of those ideas and interpreted them for my own design. So I think retro kits like that, you wouldn't see them necessarily as a retro kit on first glance unless you knew the history. It's not just a straight remake of an old kit, but I really like it when brands do this, when they take an old design and interpret it and put their own stamp on it while still having that thread, that connection to the old kit. There's also a time and place for a direct remake, of course, but I think that's what separates a good retro kit from a not quite so good retro kit. We can also talk about retro remakes. I think that's such an interesting area of the industry, and I think retro remakes, that is your kind of school draw shirts, and there are many other brands that do these remakes. They fulfill an important part in the industry, and they've kind of filled a big gap, I would say. Given the price point of these shirts is typically a bit lower than a replica shirt, I think we can see how the popularity of that really suggests that brands need to be doing a better job of pricing their replicas appropriately. Again, that's a big topic, but I do think retro designs, they're always going to be there, we're always going to love them. In an ideal world, brands wouldn't just be stuck in an echo chamber constantly rehashing designs and not doing anything new and fresh. That wouldn't be quite so good for us. Hopefully we do see new and creative designs in tandem with some really tasteful, really well designed retro looks. S is for sleeves. Now, sleeves are an integral part of a football shirt, and there's so much that we could talk about. One of the things, of course, would be the eternal short sleeve, long sleeve debate. Many people, including myself, are huge long sleeve advocates. And indeed, if you think about the sleeves themselves, they often contain so much of a design of a shirt. If you think of particular brands, take someone like Adidas and their 3 stripes, which often run down sleeves, or Hummel with their chevrons, their iconic chevrons, which again can be seen on the sleeves of the shirt. Indeed, sleeves also often contain competition patches, and even now sponsors are being placed on sleeves. So there's much to be said about sleeves. Again, going back to the long sleeve discussion, I really do like to collect and wear long sleeve shirts, and typically long sleeve shirts are worth a little bit more. But that is S. Next up, we have T, and T is for template. Now, templates have been around in the shirt game for a long time. The word template itself gets a bit of a bad rep, but as many of you will know, often some of the best shirts of all time have been templates. Template, quite simply, being a design which is essentially the same and just tweaked in minor ways and used for multiple teams. Now, there are many reasons why a brand would produce a template. Of course, it cuts down on production costs and time, but actually from a design perspective, there's a lot that can be said about templates. It's not simply a cost-cutting exercise. Often the template is a way for a brand to tell a story, communicate whatever design story they want to tell. And it's funny when you ask people what their favourite shirts are, or to recall a particular time in the past when it comes to shirts, people often bring up templates because they are so important. So take the noughties for example. The Total 90 template was a really important template. For many reasons it was certainly synonymous with the middle part of the decade, and a lot of people, particularly people around my age, have a lot of fondness for the Total 90 template. I indeed love the Total 90 template because it reminds you of a time when I was watching a lot of football, and I think of those great adverts that Nike had, the Olay advert with Portugal, Brazil, and I really like what Nike did with the template. They would tweak it in really interesting ways. Sometimes the kind of piping that they had on the front of the shirt would connect in the middle. Sometimes it would run down to the bottom hem. You had different patterns that were used on the shirt. Sometimes they were kind of subliminal patterns. Sometimes you had things like stripes and sashes. And there was a huge array of colour options. Indeed, many bespoke colourways within that construction or that template. Of course, you also had to think about the boots that they had, the Total 90 boots and the kind of leisure wear stuff. And Nike did such a good job at that time of connecting all these different product lines. And it's funny, over time, popularity for these kind of old templates only grows. I say old, it's not even that old, is it? Going even further back, many people love some of the great Adidas templates. We touched on that earlier. So templates are hugely important. And indeed, I would encourage you to maybe take a bit of a fresh view. If you're someone who hates templates, that can be understandable. There have been some bad ones over the years, and templates can certainly be used badly as much as they can be used well. But again, if you look through your collection, you've probably got a bunch of templates, and they can often be really great. I love seeing these connections when you have two teams from different parts of the world that share the same design through the use of templates. It's a great subject, one we can dig more into, as with pretty much every other letter on this list. U is for undershirts or base layers. Now, from a football shirt perspective, base layers have only grown in popularity over the years. And indeed, now it is quite common. If you think about what we just discussed with sleeves, it's quite common for players to wear short sleeve shirts with base layers or undershirts. And this can be quite interesting from a design perspective because quite often those base layers don't quite match up from a colour perspective. Sometimes they do, and sometimes brands, if they're some of the bigger brands, might even provide bespoke base layers which are matched in colour to the particular shirt. Sometimes that's not possible. Where things can get really fun is if you have patterned undershirts and base layers, and there have been some examples, though it's not as common. But again, from a football shirt perspective, it's always interesting to see how these things mirror up, how these things match up. I would certainly be in the camp of saying that long sleeve shirts are superior to the short sleeve undershirt combo. But if we approach this letter from another angle, we can also talk about the many celebrations over the years, the iconic celebrations that have been made with custom shirts or t-shirts that have messages on them. And indeed, the book next to me, I Belong to Jesus, is all about that. Many of you will know the story of that book. I think in an earlier episode on this channel we talked about it. I'd recommend checking it out. You probably can't get that book easily actually because it was a limited run, but indeed all those great celebrations during the match, post-match, that have been made with messages underneath a player's kit. And that still goes on, of course, despite a bit of a clampdown in some ways on celebrations like that. They still happen, and I absolutely love it when it does happen. I think it's always really interesting, and it produces so many memorable moments. So undershirts, base layers, they're not going away anytime soon. I would love to see more and more patterned undershirts, and if that happens, I'll be really happy. I think some of the governing bodies might struggle with that idea. They might want to restrict that, but hopefully we do see some creativity in that area moving forward. V is for Vaporknit, and you can include in this list other brand shirt technology names. Now these names like Vaporknit and TechFit, Formotion, they're kind of buzzwords really. They often don't tell much in and of themselves, but indeed when a brand brings out a range of shirts with their latest technology, it's always interesting. And for someone like me, I love seeing a brand put all their best efforts, all their resources into creating new shirts which have different ventilation patterns, which have different seams and construction. And the Vaporknit range that Nike did was one of my personal favourites, and I think it was one of Nike's most successful. Just from a shirt perspective, if you have a Vaporknit shirt or you can get hold of a Vaporknit shirt, and there are indeed many out there, it's really fun to see those differences. And they feel great. I would say they feel really good to wear, but just from an aesthetic point of view, seeing those ridges and those sections on the kit which have this wonderful pattern because of the Vaporknit technology. Now, of course, the kind of margins that we're talking about here in terms of the benefits of that don't apply to 99.9% of us. But again, from a design perspective and from a collecting perspective, it's really cool to see these player spec or player issue shirts becoming more accessible. And despite the relatively high cost at RRP, if you're willing to wait for a sale, I'd recommend looking out for these types of shirts. So currently with Nike, it's the Dry Fit ADV tech that you're looking for. With Adidas, it's called Heat Ready. W is for women's kits. Now, there have been many excellent bespoke kits for the women's game, and this isn't just a modern phenomenon. Indeed, if we go back multiple decades, if you look at international teams like Germany and USA, some of those kits were really quite creative and quite strong from a design perspective. And in recent years, as the women's game has exploded in popularity, it's quite often the case that the women's kits are much better than the men's kits. Just take someone like England. Their kits, the England women's kits, have been absolutely great, and I would say they've even edged ahead of the men's kits. It's been quite strong. Nike have been very good actually for England, both men's and women's, but again the women's kits more than hold their own. And notably this year we've had the likes of Arsenal releasing a bespoke shirt for the women's team, which is something they've not done before, I believe. So it's been a lot of fun to see. Some people would argue that it's actually better to have a women's team playing in the same kit as the men's team, and I can certainly understand that perspective. But ultimately, I think it should be down to the teams. If they want to have bespoke kits, or they want to have their own designs, all power to them. I think that's great. I think for me, the focus should be on the accessibility of these shirts. So making sure that if you have a men's design or a women's design, then it's available in men's and women's size. And I think that's important. And I think at the end of the day, it just means you have more people wearing those shirts, more fans able to get hold of them, more collectors able to add them to their collections. So that is W. W is for women's kits. X, well, I've cheated a bit for this one. I've said X is for collaborations. Now by this I mean Juve Palace, PSG Jordan. The little X that you get in between either side of a collaboration. I had to mention collaborations in this list because it has been such a huge area of growth. And many of the things we've talked about have been kind of trends or things which we've seen a lot of. But collaborations, I would say, are certainly a longer term trend, something which really will, I think, become more and more foundational even. It's fascinating to see that it's not just a big team. So I mentioned Juve and PSG, two clubs who have had some high profile collaborations, and particularly Jordan PSG has been interesting seeing the Jordan brand, which is a subsidiary of Nike, really going full throttle, producing home, away, third, European kits, all these sorts of things, and amazing lifestyle ranges. But seeing collaborations for, again, lower league teams, seeing celebrities and brands getting involved with football clubs, putting their stamp on designs, I think it's a fascinating area, and more often than not, I think it has produced some really interesting shirts. I think the biggest thing, particularly when you look at the top end of the game, is that it's not enough, I would say, to simply slap a logo on and call it a day. You really want to see that marriage, that synergy between a brand and a football club. And I think the best designs often are the ones which you can see immediately. Oh yeah, that's an element of the brand, that's the colourway or the pattern or the little nod in some ways to a brand, which still feels at home with the club. And that's a really hard balance. But I think when that is struck, when that balance is struck, when you do have that great synergy between either side of a collaboration, it's amazing. And I see no reason why this shouldn't continue. Of course, as always, there's a debate with these things. Many traditionalists and people would say that the involvement of brands into football can largely be seen as a cash grab exercise. But again, there's ways that this can be done. I think particularly when it comes to things like third shirts or limited edition shirts that we spoke about before, those are the best places to really get people involved. And indeed, it is largely a marketing exercise. Ultimately, clubs are able to leverage the audiences of these other brands or celebrities and things like this to great effect. I think it's also really cool when you get kind of designers and people who ultimately can contribute a lot aesthetically to a shirt. Don't get me wrong, I understand why you get brands and celebrities in just because they're big, but I really love seeing some of these kits where clubs and brands work with designers and maybe tell the story of a local designer or something like that. That can be really cool. But collaborations, I think they brought a lot to the football shirt world, and I'm actually quite excited to see what new partnerships and collaborations we will get in the coming years. Y is for youth team shirts. Now, if you're a bit of a nerd like me, you know that actually youth team shirts or under 18 shirts or whatever age category you might have, these kits can be quite interesting from a design perspective. Take, for example, the fact that if the first team, the senior team, has an alcohol sponsor or a gambling sponsor, those aren't allowed on youth team shirts. So you will get youth teams playing in shirts with a different sponsor or no sponsor at all. Interestingly, it is now not uncommon to see clubs sell versions of their youth team shirts in adult sizes on their club stores. So West Ham are a great example. They've been doing this for many years. And it can be quite fun actually, again, as a collector. If you're a West Ham fan or someone who wants to buy a West Ham shirt and you might not like their gambling sponsor, why not look at the youth team shirts? If they do sell them, it can be quite a good avenue to go down. And indeed, I can think of shirts that I've had in my collection over the years which have been youth team designs, and sometimes they have been bespoke. I remember a Norway under 19 shirt which I had, and one fun thing that Norway did around this era was that their youth team shirts had a different trim colour to the senior team, and I think there was even a few versions or a few trim colours for different age categories. An incredibly niche thing, but that was a really fun one. One of the memorable stories I have from my collecting time of a shirt which again had this little difference because it was a youth team shirt. But we've made it to the end of our list. Z is for Zeus, and by extension I would include other smaller brands. So Zeus are a fantastic football shirt manufacturer who do some great work, particularly in Italy, and that is really where you can find some designs which stand tall, stand amongst the other great kits of the football shirt world. Zeus have been doing some great work for a while. They're one of those brands who really do punch above their weight. And to give another name, what about Charlie? Based in Mexico, they've been doing some really good work. Again, in the last several years, I've had a few Charlie kits in my own collection and the quality is absolutely superb. It's been really great to see their reputation grow, and they're even beginning to expand outside of Mexico. Take Roby as well, and this is a brand based in the Netherlands. Again, it's so cool to see these brands not just kind of churning out any old kit, but actually producing designs which are stunning, which really do tap into what we love about collecting kits. Crazy colorways and superb stories with these really great connections to the clubs that the shirts are for. And there are many more I can mention. I think it's really cool as well to look at brands which aren't necessarily in the pro game a lot at the moment, but which are poised to enter that world. So think of something like Hope and Glory based here in the UK, or Icarus of course over in Philadelphia. Shout out to the little guys, shout out to all these brands who are doing great work, often which rivals or even betters the stuff we see from the big brands. Your collection ought to have a bunch of these shirts mixed in if it hasn't already. And guys, that is our list. I'll run through them all now quickly. A is for Adidas, B is for Blackout, C is for collars, D is for Drake Ramberg, E is for Embossed, F is for flag details, G is for Goalkeeper kits, H is for hoops, I is for Iridescent, J is for Jacquard, K is for Kettering Tyres, L limited edition, M Mashup, N Nike, O Onesie kit, P player issue, Q quality fakes, R retro, S sleeves, T templates, U is for undershirts, V is for Vaporknit, W is for women's kits, X is for collaborations, Y is for youth team shirts, and Z is for Zeus. We did it. It has been a long video, so long in fact that the filming of this has gone over 2 days. That's why I've changed clothes partway through this, but thank you for sticking with this. If there was any letter which you particularly enjoyed, or if there was anything that you'd like me to expand on, you guys know me well. Basically, I could ramble about anything, but if something resonated with you, let me know, and this really would help shape my future content. Let me know. I always love to hear from you. And of course, you can also just ask me any questions, and I'll answer a bunch of them at the start of the next video, any comments that you leave here. And before we get out of here, don't forget to subscribe, guys. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video. And if you want to support me further, I have a Patreon with some really fun benefits. There's exclusive giveaways just for patrons. If I sell shirts from my collection, patrons get first dibs on that. And indeed, there is a shirt that you get as part of your support. A shirt I designed with Icarus. We just mentioned Icarus at the end of our list. But thanks for watching, guys. It's been a lot of fun. And I will see you very soon for another video. Take care.